Imagine waking up in a medieval town, where the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and smoke from countless fires. You're surrounded by narrow streets, lined with wooden houses that teeter on the edge of collapse. The sound of horses' hooves clatter against cobblestones, while children play barefoot in the dirt. Life here is hard, but one constant threat looms over everyone: famine. Famine wasn't just a rare occurrence. It was an ever-present danger. In the Middle Ages, most people lived on the brink of starvation, their lives hanging by a thread with every harvest. A bad season could mean disaster for entire communities. Without modern farming techniques or reliable trade networks, townspeople were at the mercy of nature. Droughts, floods, or plagues could wipe out crops, leaving families to face hunger and desperation. But how did these towns protect themselves? How did they ensure that, even in the worst times, people had enough to eat? Let's dive into the fascinating world of medieval food security and discover the strategies that kept cities alive during the darkest times. If famine was the enemy, then merchants were the unsung heroes of medieval towns. In a world where food could vanish from markets overnight, it was the guilds and trading networks that kept cities from collapsing into chaos. These powerful organizations weren't just about regulating prices or controlling quality. They were lifelines in times of crisis. Medieval guilds were like today's trade unions mixed with corporate boards. They controlled everything from who could sell grain to how much bread should cost. And when disaster struck, be it a failed harvest or a sudden influx of refugees, these merchant guilds stepped in to manage the flow of food. Imagine this. A harsh winter wipes out crops across the countryside. Villages are starving, and city officials panic as granaries empty faster than expected. Who do they turn to? Not kings or priests, but the merchant guilds. These traders had access to vast networks stretching across Europe and beyond. From the grain fields of Poland to the spice ports of Venice, they moved goods through roads, rivers, and seas. When local supplies ran dry, they imported food from regions that still had surpluses. But their power wasn't just logistical, it was political. Merchant guilds often held seats on town councils, giving them direct influence over policies during famines. They could restrict exports of grain to ensure enough remained for locals, or organize emergency purchases from abroad. And they didn't act alone. Local authorities worked closely with these guilds to control prices, prevent hoarding, and even distribute food directly to the poor. In some cases, wealthy merchants funded soup kitchens or paid for extra shipments of grain at their own expense. Not always out of charity, but to maintain stability and protect their own economic interests. Without these merchant networks, medieval cities wouldn't have stood a chance against famine. They were the invisible force holding society together when nature turned cruel. If merchants were the arteries of food supply, then granaries were the heart, the central organ that kept a medieval town alive. Imagine you're the mayor of a bustling city in 14th century Europe. The harvest was poor last year. Crops rotted in the fields. Rumors of famine spread like wildfire. What do? You turn to your granary, the fortress of food security. Granaries were not just storage buildings. They were carefully designed fortresses meant to protect the most valuable resource in any town: grain. Without it, there was no bread. Without bread, there was no peace. These structures were built with thick stone walls to resist fire and pests. Some had raised floors on stilts to keep rodents out. Others had smooth clay-lined interiors to prevent insects from nesting in the walls. In many towns, they were placed near the center of the city or within castle grounds, guarded and protected like treasure vaults. But storing grain wasn't just about architecture. It was about control. Towns had strict rules about who could store grain, who could sell it, and when it could be released. In times of crisis, the city council would declare a grain lockdown, forbidding merchants from exporting grain until local needs were met. In some cities like London and Paris, officials called corn measurers were appointed to inspect every sack of grain entering or leaving the city. They made sure the weight was correct, the quality acceptable, and that no one was hoarding for profit. And hoarders did exist. Some wealthy traders tried to stockpile grain during shortages, waiting for prices to skyrocket before selling. But medieval authorities didn't take kindly to this. Punishments ranged from heavy fines to public humiliation, being dunked in the river or locked in the stocks with a sign reading "Famine Profiteer." Even with all these precautions, keeping grain safe was a constant battle. Mice and rats were relentless. Mold and dampness could ruin entire stores. And sometimes, people took matters into their own hands, Riots often broke out when citizens believed the rich were hiding grain while the poor starved. To prevent panic, some towns used a system of bread pricing. Officials set the price of bread based on the current grain supply. When grain was scarce, prices went up slightly, but never enough to exclude the poor completely. The granary wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of hope, a promise that even in the darkest times, the town still had a fighting chance. When the fields around a medieval town failed, survival depended on one thing: trade. Cities couldn't rely solely on local harvests. A single bad season could wipe out food supplies for thousands. So when famine loomed, towns turned to their most powerful allies: foreign traders and long-distance merchants. These traders were the lifeblood of urban survival. They navigated dangerous roads, unpredictable seas, and hostile territories to bring in grain, salted fish, dried fruit, and other essentials. Some came from nearby regions like Flanders or Burgundy, while others traveled from as far as the Middle East and North Africa. Imagine standing at the docks of Venice or Genoa. The air is thick with the smell of salt and spice. Ships arrive from across the Mediterranean, their hulls packed with barrels of olive oil, sacks of wheat, and crates of almonds. These goods had been loaded weeks earlier in Alexandria or Constantinople, carried by sailors who risked storms, pirates, and shipwrecks to deliver them. Inland cities weren't left behind. Caravans of oxen and mules wound through Europe's forests and mountains, following ancient Roman roads and newly built trade routes. These convoys brought Baltic grain to Germany, Polish rye to France, and dried cod from Scandinavia to England. But importing food wasn't just about logistics, it was also about politics. Towns often formed agreements with trading hubs to ensure steady supply lines. Some paid tribute to local lords or city-states in exchange for safe passage. Others negotiated directly with merchant guilds, offering tax breaks or exclusive trading rights in return for guaranteed shipments during times of crisis. The Hanseatic League, a powerful network of northern European cities, played a crucial role in this system. Their ships controlled much of the grain and fish trade across the Baltic and North Seas. Without them, many German and English towns would have faced starvation. And yet, even with these networks in place, importing food was never certain. Wars could cut off supply lines. Rulers might ban exports during famines in their own lands. And sometimes, greedy middlemen hoarded goods, waiting for prices to skyrocket before releasing them. Still, for medieval towns, the alternative was unthinkable. Without access to foreign food, they would collapse within weeks. So, despite the risks and costs, they kept sending ships, hiring guards for caravans, and negotiating deals with distant powers. Because when your people are starving, the only option is to find food, no matter where it comes from. When the grain ran out and the merchants couldn't bring more, medieval towns faced a grim reality. People were going to starve unless something changed. So what did they eat when even the most basic food disappeared from markets? The answer was simple, but horrifying. In times of extreme famine, people turned to desperate measures. They didn't wait for help to arrive. They searched their homes, their streets, and even the fields outside city walls for anything that could be eaten. Imagine this. You've already finished your last loaf of bread. The baker has nothing left. The granary is locked and guarded. So you walk through the town, looking for scraps. You find weeds growing in alleyways, roots buried under the dirt, and bits of straw left over from animal feed. These weren't delicacies, they were survival tools. Historical records show that during famines, people cooked soups made from boiled grass, nettle leaves, and moss. Some ground acorns into flour or soaked bark to make it soft enough to chew. In the worst cases, families resorted to eating leather, boiled belts, old shoes, or even book bindings, just to give their stomachs something to digest. Children were often the first to fall ill. Their bodies weakened quickly without proper nutrients. But parents had no choice. They gave them whatever they could find. And then there were the pests. Rats were everywhere, in homes, on rooftops, in storage rooms. People hunted them like game animals, roasting them over open fires if they could catch them. Cats and dogs were not pets in times of famine. They were meals waiting to happen. Even insects became food sources. Some roasted beetles or ground locusts in a paste. Others boiled snails collected from damp corners of the city. But perhaps the most disturbing practice came from the poorest districts, the collection of waste grain. After carts unloaded sacks at the market, small children would follow behind, picking up spilled grains from the muddy ground. These tiny pieces of wheat or barley were washed, if water wasn't too scarce, and boiled into a thin porridge. It wasn't much, but it kept people alive for a few more days. None of these foods were tasty. None were healthy, but they were all that stood between starvation and survival. Families who lasted long enough eventually prayed for the return of normal food, even if it meant going back to the barely edible, rock-hard bread they once hated. Because compared to chewing on tree bark, it suddenly seemed like a feast. When the granaries were empty, the merchants had nothing to sell, and the bread was made of bark, there was still one last hope: charity. In medieval towns, when hunger reached its peak, the poor turned not just to their rulers or guilds, but to the church and the wealthy elite for help. Charity wasn't just a moral duty in the Middle Ages, it was a survival mechanism. The Catholic Church played a central role in feeding the hungry. Monasteries, convents, and parish churches ran soup kitchens, distributed bread, and offered shelter to the desperate. These acts weren't only about compassion. They were also seen as a way to earn favor with God. Donating to the poor was believed to guarantee a place in heaven. Imagine standing in front of a monastery gate at dawn. The air is cold, and your stomach growls from hunger. You're not alone. Dozens of people crowd around, waiting for the monks inside to open the doors. When they do, you're handed a simple meal: a piece of coarse bread, some thin stew, and maybe even a small piece of cheese if the monastery had a good harvest. This wasn't a daily occurrence. Often, charity meals were given only on certain days or during extreme crises. But for many, this was the difference between life and death. Nobles and wealthy merchants also contributed. Some did so out of genuine concern for the people living in their towns. Others saw it as a way to maintain order and prevent riots. A starving population could turn violent quickly, and handing out food was cheaper than hiring guards. In some cities, laws required the rich to give alms regularly. In others, public shame was used as motivation. Those who refused to donate might find their names read aloud in church as sinners. Even beggars played a role in this system. They traveled from town to town, relying on handouts from households and religious institutions. Some were genuinely disabled or elderly. Others were con artists who exaggerated their suffering to get more coins or food. But charity wasn't always fair. There were reports of corruption, officials skimming off the top before food reached the poor. Sometimes, it was only given to those who attended church regularly or supported the ruling class. And in times of extreme famine, even the wealthiest couldn't feed everyone. Still, for thousands of people, these charitable efforts meant survival. Without the church's kitchens, the nobles' grain donations, and the occasional mercy of a merchant, entire neighborhoods would have starved. Charity in the Middle Ages wasn't perfect, but in a world without welfare or emergency aid, it was often the only thing keeping people alive. When food became scarce, medieval towns didn't just rely on charity or imports. They turned to strict laws and rationing systems. These weren't just gentle suggestions. They were enforced by city officials, guilds, and even the church. The goal? To prevent hoarding, control prices, and make sure that everyone, from the poorest beggar to the wealthiest merchant, had at least some chance of survival. Imagine waking up one morning to find that your local baker is selling bread at double the usual price. You're not alone in your outrage. The streets are filled with angry voices, people shouting about hunger, injustice, and greed. This kind of panic was common during famines. And cities knew that if they didn't act fast, riots would break out. So they did something radical. They passed emergency food laws. In many European towns, authorities declared grain a public necessity. That meant no one could stockpile it for profit. No one could export it without permission. And anyone caught hoarding food risked severe punishment: fines, public shaming, or even imprisonment. Some cities went further. They created official bread pricing systems. Officials determined how much bread should cost based on the current supply of grain. This kept prices stable and ensured that even the poor could afford a loaf now and then. In London, Paris, and Florence, city councils appointed special food inspectors, men who checked every sack of grain entering or leaving the market. They made sure the weight was accurate, the quality acceptable, and that no one was hiding extra supplies in their homes or warehouses. But these laws weren't always fair. Sometimes the rich found ways around them. Wealthy merchants bribed officials. Nobles stored grain in secret cellars. And when the poor broke the rules, even just trying to feed their families, they were punished more severely than the powerful. Still, despite corruption and inequality, these laws worked well enough to keep cities from descending into complete chaos. One of the most extreme examples comes from Venice during a major famine in the 14th century. The government took full control of all grain supplies. They distributed daily rations to citizens, sometimes only a few ounces per person, but it was enough to stop mass starvation. In some places, bakers were ordered to use alternative ingredients when wheat ran low. They mixed bran, acorns, or even sawdust in a bread to stretch supplies. It wasn't tasty and often caused stomach problems, but again, it kept people alive. The system wasn't perfect, but in a world where hunger could lead to revolt, and revolt could lead to war, controlling food was one of the most important jobs a medieval town could do. Because when people are starving, the only thing more dangerous than enforcing food laws is letting them go uncontrolled. When the countryside failed to feed them, medieval townspeople didn't just wait for relief. They grew food where they could. Despite the narrow streets, crowded markets, and limited space, city dwellers found creative ways to grow vegetables, herbs, and even small fruit trees right in the heart of urban chaos. Forget sprawling farms. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, people made do with whatever land they had. Every inch counted. Backyards, courtyards, rooftops, and even the walls of homes became mini-farms. Imagine walking through a bustling town and seeing greenery peeking out from behind wooden fences. In one yard, a woman tends rows of onions and leeks. Nearby, children chase each other between barrels filled with soil, where cabbage and carrots grow slowly under the sun. A man climbs a ladder to check on his rooftop garden, carefully watering plants that will supplement his family's meals. These weren't just decorative gardens, they were survival tools. Most urban farming focused on crops that required little space and matured quickly. Onions, garlic, lettuce, radishes, and herbs like parsley and sage. These plants provided not only flavor, but also nutrition in a diet often lacking fresh food. Some wealthier families had larger plots, sometimes called kitchen gardens, enclosed by low stone or wooden fences. These gardens were carefully planned, with sections dedicated to medicinal herbs, fruits like apples and berries, and even small beehives for honey. But it wasn't just the rich who gardened. Even the poorest citizens found ways to grow something. Tenement houses shared communal spaces where neighbors worked together to plant and harvest. Some built raised beds along alleyways. Others used pots and wooden crates placed outside windowsills, turning every available surface into a growing spot. In some cities, local authorities encouraged urban farming by offering small grants or tax breaks to those who maintain gardens. Towns near rivers sometimes allowed residents to build floating gardens on rafts anchored to the shore, an early form of hydroponic farming. Animals also played a role. Chickens were common in backyards, providing eggs and meat. Goats were kept for milk when possible. Even pigs were occasionally raised in city corners, though they often caused problems by rooting through trash and damaging crops. Of course, growing food in a medieval city was no easy task. Pests were everywhere. Rats, insects, and even stray dogs would destroy crops overnight. Water was scarce, especially during droughts. And with so many people living close together, disputes over space, sunlight, and water access were frequent. Still, despite the challenges, these urban farms helped keep people fed when food prices soared or supply lines broke down. They were proof that, even in the dirtiest, most chaotic cities of the Middle Ages, people refused to give up. They planted seeds in tiny corners of hope, hoping for a harvest that might just mean another day of survival. When the official food supply failed and city laws tightened their grip on grain and bread, a shadow economy rose to take its place, the black market. In times of famine, desperation turned honest people into thieves and merchants into smugglers. With prices controlled by law and supplies hoarded by the rich, those who needed food had only one option: find it elsewhere. Imagine walking through a narrow alley behind the town's main market. It's late at night, the streets are quiet, and the only light comes from flickering torches held by cloaked figures. A whisper calls out, "Got flour, fresh this morning." You look around nervously. This isn't just illegal. It could get you whipped or thrown in the stocks. But your children haven't eaten in 2 days. This was the reality of the medieval black market, a hidden network of secret traders, stolen goods, and desperate buyers. When hunger struck, people didn't wait for charity or rely on guilt alone. They found ways to survive, even if it meant breaking the law. The most common items traded were grain, salted meat, dried fish, and sometimes even bread sold directly from bakers who secretly baked extra loaves. These goods were often stolen from granaries, intercepted shipments, or quietly produced outside city regulations. Wealthy merchants weren't the only ones involved. Sometimes it was poor farmers sneaking food into town after being banned from selling locally. Other times, it was corrupt officials skimming off the top before distributing rations. In some cities, entire gangs formed around this underground trade. They guarded their routes fiercely, bribed guards to look the other way, and even set up fake stalls during the day while moving real goods at night. One of the most infamous cases came from 14th century Paris, where a secret ring of bakers and millers operated a massive illegal flour trade. They bought stolen grain from smugglers, ground it in hidden mills, and sold loaves under cover of darkness. When authorities finally cracked down, they arrested over 50 people, including city officials who had been profiting from a scheme. But not everyone saw these traders as criminals. To many starving families, they were lifelines. If the government wouldn't feed them and the guilds wouldn't help, then who else could they turn to? Of course, not all black market deals ended well. Some sellers mixed dirt into flour to stretch supplies. Others sold spoiled meat or watered-down wine. And when the authorities caught someone, punishment was swift: fines, public humiliation, or even execution for repeat offenders. Still, no matter how harsh the penalties, the black market never disappeared. As long as there were hungry people and food locked away by the powerful, there would always be those willing to risk everything for a bite to eat. When food was gone, laws were broken, and charity couldn't feed everyone. Medieval towns turned to one of the oldest forms of survival: work. But not just any kind of work. In times of famine, cities didn't stop building walls or repairing roads because they needed something more important than construction. They needed people to eat. Imagine this. You're a father of 5. The bread lines are empty. Your savings are gone. You haven't eaten in 2 days. And then you hear it. The town crier announces that anyone willing to work will be fed. It wasn't a high-paying job. It wasn't even a job with dignity. But it gave you bread. This system was known as famine relief through public works. Towns would launch massive projects, building city walls, digging canals, repairing bridges, or expanding fortifications. Not because they suddenly needed infrastructure upgrades, but because they needed to create jobs. The logic was simple. If people had work, they could earn food. If they earned food, they wouldn't riot. And if they didn't riot, the city might survive another week. In some places like Florence and Bruges, officials went further. They paid workers directly in grain or bread instead of coin, ensuring that their wages translated immediately into nourishment. These laborers were often given double portions for bringing their families along to help. And the work was hard. You'd wake before dawn, already weak from hunger, and join hundreds of others at the construction site. Some carried stones, others dug trenches, while a few hauled wood through the streets. Supervisors kept order with whips and threats, not out of cruelty, but because desperation made people reckless. A single loaf stolen from the supply cart could mean death for someone else. These projects weren't temporary fixes. Many lasted years. In times of repeated famines, cities used them as long-term strategies to keep population stable. Some historians believe that parts of Europe's most famous medieval architecture, including sections of city walls and aqueducts, were built entirely during food crises. Even monasteries got involved. Some hired poor workers to build new chapels or expand cloisters, paying them with meals and shelter. Others offered daily work in exchange for religious services, blending charity with spiritual duty. The idea wasn't unique to Europe either. Similar systems existed in China, the Middle East, and North Africa, where rulers funded large-scale irrigation projects or temple restorations specifically to employ starving citizens. Of course, not all workers were treated fairly. Some were forced into labor under harsh conditions. Others found themselves trapped in debt bondage, working for years without ever earning enough to leave the city. Still, for thousands of people, these public works programs were the only things standing between them and starvation. They were proof that in the darkest times, medieval towns didn't just wait for help. They built it. When famine struck, it wasn't just merchants and guilds who held power. The nobility also played a crucial role in feeding the hungry. Medieval towns were not isolated islands of survival. They existed within a feudal system where local lords controlled vast lands, collected taxes, and often held direct authority over food distribution. When crops failed, these powerful figures had the resources to act, and sometimes the responsibility to do so. Imagine you're a peasant living on the edge of starvation. Your village has nothing left. The granary is empty. The merchants have fled. You look up at the castle on the hill and wonder, will the Lord help us? Sometimes the answer was yes. Lords weren't just warriors or landowners. They were also providers. Many kept large reserves of grain and livestock, specifically for emergencies. Some saw it as a duty, part of their role as protectors of the people. Others did it out of self-interest, knowing that if the poor starved, they might rise in revolt. In many regions, noble families opened their stores during famines, distributing bread, meat, and wine to those in need. Some hosted banquets not for luxury, but for survival, offering meals to hundreds of starving townspeople under the banners of charity and faith. But this aid came with conditions. Help from a nobility often meant loyalty in return. Those who received food might be expected to work the fields when harvest season returned, or serve in the Lord's army when war broke out. In some cases, entire families became bound to a noble household, trading independence for survival. Some nobles went further than others. In France and England, certain lords invested in infrastructure like grain silos, irrigation systems, and even communal ovens where villagers could bake bread together. These investments helped communities withstand future crises. Others used famine as a way to consolidate power. They raised rents, demanded higher taxes, or forced peasants into debt bondage, all while keeping their own pantries full. The church often worked alongside the nobility, encouraging them to give alms and support the poor. Sermons warned that failing to help the hungry would damn the soul, a powerful motivator in a deeply religious age. And yet, despite the risks of rebellion and divine punishment, not every noble stepped in to help. Some hoarded food, selling it at inflated prices when desperation turned people violent. Others simply abandoned their lands, retreating to distant estates where famine hadn't yet reached. But for those who did act, whether out of kindness or caution, their intervention could mean the difference between life and death. Because in medieval towns, when the worst came to the worst, the only thing standing between a starving population and chaos was often a single noble with a full pantry and an open gate. Famine didn't just bring hunger, it brought out the worst in people. When food vanished from markets and desperation took hold, medieval towns didn't descend into quiet suffering. They exploded into chaos, violence, and cruelty. Starvation turned neighbors into enemies, families into strangers, and rulers into tyrants. Imagine walking through a town you once knew. The streets are eerily silent. The baker's shop is boarded up. The market square is empty except for one thing. A crowd gathered around a wooden platform. A man stands on it, arms tied behind his back, eyes wide with fear. He was caught stealing bread, and now he's going to die for it. During famines, theft wasn't just a crime, it was treason against survival. Punishments were brutal. Thieves had their hands chopped off, were dragged through the streets, or hanged in public as warnings to others. In some places, starving people were executed simply for begging too loudly. But not all violence came from the poor. Wealthy merchants and nobles hoarded grain, waiting for prices to skyrocket before selling. Some locked their stores and watched from castle windows as people starved below. Others used famine as leverage, demanding labor, loyalty, or even children be given away in exchange for food. In extreme cases, entire towns collapsed into anarchy. Riots broke out when people believed the rich were hiding food. Granaries were looted by angry mobs. Officials were dragged from their homes and beaten. In some cities, guards were ordered to shoot looters on sight, and they did. There were darker stories still. Reports from medieval Europe tell of people turning to unthinkable means to survive. Cannibalism was rare, but not unheard of. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, rumors spread of mothers eating their own children. Some families abandoned infants at crossroads, hoping someone else might feed them. Even animals weren't safe. Dogs and cats disappeared from streets, ending up in pots. Horses were slaughtered for meat. In the worst cases, people ate rats, worms, or boiled leather just to feel full for a few minutes. Famine also bred suspicion and blame. Who caused this? Was it God punishing sinners? Was it witches poisoning wells? Was it foreigners bringing disease? Scapegoats emerged quickly. Minorities were targeted, Jews, foreigners, and the mentally ill were accused of causing the crisis. Mobs formed, attacking homes, burning people alive, and blaming the hungry for their own suffering. Governments tried to control the chaos. Laws were passed forbidding hoarding. Prices were set by decree. Grain exports were banned. but enforcement was nearly impossible. Corruption ran deep. Officials accepted bribes. Merchants smuggled food out of town under cover of night. And always the cycle repeated. A bad harvest, rising prices, panic, riots, crackdowns, more hunger. Famine wasn't just about food. It was about power, fear, and human nature breaking under pressure. It showed that when people have nothing left, not even hope, they will do anything to survive, even if it means tearing the world apart. The medieval world was a battlefield of hunger and survival, but from that struggle, we learned lessons that still shape how we feed billions today. Imagine watching a medieval town slowly starve. The granaries are empty. The merchants have fled. The black market thrives in the shadows. People eat bark, leather, and weeds just to survive another day. Desperation turns to riots, and order collapses under the weight of hunger. Now imagine looking at the modern world. Supermarkets filled with food from every corner of the globe. Refrigerators humming quietly in every home. Trucks rolling through highways carrying fresh produce across countries. It feels like we've conquered famine, but in truth, we're only one step ahead of the same problems that haunted the Middle Ages. Because even now, food security is fragile. Modern cities don't rely on guilds or nobles. They depend on global trade networks, climate stability, and political peace. When any of those fail, chaos follows. A single drought can cripple harvests. A war can cut off grain exports. A pandemic can disrupt supply chains. And yet, unlike medieval towns, we have tools to prevent catastrophe. We build massive grain reserves, just like the fortified granaries of old. We regulate prices to stop hoarding. We invest in urban farming, much like the rooftop gardens of medieval homes. And when disaster strikes, we launch emergency food programs, echoing the public works projects that once fed starving workers. But there's one big difference. Medieval societies reacted to famine after it struck. We have the power to predict and prevent it, if we choose to use it wisely. Today, early warning systems track crop failures before they become disasters. Scientists breed crops that can survive droughts and floods. Governments stockpile food for emergencies. International aid organizations coordinate relief efforts before people start starving. Still, the past warns us, no system is perfect. In parts of the world, famine still exists. In war zones, food is used as a weapon. In poor communities, access to nutrition remains unequal. Corruption and greed still distort markets. And climate change threatens to undo decades of progress. So what do we really learn from medieval food struggles? That food isn't just about eating. It's about power, control, and survival. That when people go hungry, society breaks down. And that the only way to protect against famine is to prepare long before it comes. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this. Famine doesn't strike suddenly. It creeps in, silently, unnoticed, until it's too late. And by then, it's already too late to fix it. Famine was not just a disaster, it was a test. A test of leadership, of organization, of human will. And through that test, medieval cities proved something remarkable. They could survive. Not always beautifully, not always fairly, but survive they did. Think back to what we've covered. When food vanished from the markets, towns didn't collapse overnight. They adapted. Guilds stepped in. Granaries held out. Merchants imported supplies. Farmers grew food in unlikely corners. Even in the darkest moments, people found ways to keep going. But survival wasn't just about food. It was about community, about laws and charity, about desperation and innovation, about rulers who sometimes helped and sometimes hoarded, about ordinary people who refused to give up, even when everything seemed lost. Medieval cities were far from perfect. Their systems were flawed, often cruel, sometimes corrupt, but they were also flexible. They changed with the times, learned from crisis, and built solutions that would echo into the future. And in many ways, we still live with those lessons today. When modern governments stockpile grain, regulate prices, or launch emergency relief programs, they're following strategies first used in medieval Europe. When urban farmers grow food on rooftops or communities share resources during crises, they're continuing traditions born centuries ago. The past may seem distant, but its fingerprints are everywhere. So next time you walk through a city, look beyond the glass towers and electric lights. Imagine the streets as they once were, narrow, muddy, filled with shouting merchants and desperate families. Picture the granaries, the guild halls, the hidden gardens growing quietly behind wooden fences. Because beneath all the layers of history, one truth remains. Humanity has always found a way to survive, even in the worst of times, even when the world seemed to fall apart, even when there was nothing left but hunger,